My role is to talk about, two other groups. I'm going to describe a little more on the surveillance and registry piece, and maybe a slide on the ethics group. The people, part of the outline is what is surveillance and registry. The group is, in the paper, talks about the global public health challenges and how does surveillance and registry in the emergency department fits into those global health agendas. And then types of surveillance, and then finally what are the challenges of carrying out surveillance in LMIC settings. And finally, they talk about some of the successful examples of how others have been able to do surveillance and registry work in the LMIC context. So this is the group, again, representing many countries. Hani Muwafi from Yale is leading this group. Unfortunately, he couldn't be here today to present. So the first question was, a lot of people mix up what is surveillance and what is registry. And for clarity's sake, surveillance is, as you know, ongoing data collection, usually limited data points, usually focused on burden of disease, such as prevalence or incidence. And so the surveillance is focused on capturing large number of cases or all cases. For example, injury surveillance or infectious disease surveillance. On the other hand, registry is also about ongoing data collection, but it's more focused on more extensive data collection. It is more focused on complex questions such as quality of care. So trauma registry, for example, has a lot more data points than injury surveillance. Often we confuse. So we talk about registry, we talk about a much more extensive engagement of research and researchers. Site of surveillance, Adam talked about. We often, when you talk about emergency care research, you talk about emergency department research. And from the CLEER's perspective, emergency care research is where the emergency patient is. And often, those patients are not in your traditional emergency departments. So it could be, as you know, community, ambulances, clinics, emergency departments. And the examples for community surveillance, for example, road traffic injuries, suspected cases of Ebola viruses, influenza outbreaks, pre-hospital care system, out-of-hospital cardiac arrest system, and hospital-based systems such as injuries, stroke, child abuse, etc. So, and then, what I didn't mention, very importantly, is often ICUs and wards are like emergency department in many countries. So those terms we use mean very different things in different institutions within the same country, actually. Also, we looked at types of emergency surveillance. So, for example, there is, you could look at disease surveillance, such as head injury, cardiac arrest. Often we look at syndromic surveillance. So fever with hemorrhage, for example, a patient with suspected domestic violence with a set of signs or symptoms, or chief complaint-based surveillance. So that makes the whole discussion of surveillance quite interesting and complex, and that needs to be captured. We're going to discuss that as part of our paper. And finally, where does surveillance, why should we do surveillance, and where does it sit in the global health agenda? And the group has talked about the broad discussion and a lot of interest today around the health security agenda. So for a long time, we talked about global health as a global good. It's a good thing to do. But in the post-Ebola world, there's a lot of discussion on it's good for the security of the world or security of the countries. And emergency care surveillance provides the necessary data to identify epidemics and keep the world secure. Also, surveillance is critical in the global health agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, especially targeting road traffic injuries, non-communicable diseases, and disaster preparedness and response agenda. So there are many of these global health next steps which are dependent on what will happen in the data collection phase in the emergency departments or emergency care systems. And one of the things that we are struggling with is to define not just methodological challenges, but solutions. So what are data issues? And data definition is a huge problem for us. You know, triage means very differently. Emergency department means very different things to different people. Chief complaints are very differently documented. There are issues with data collection, where to collect data, how best to collect data, how do you analyze data when you have different data definitions across systems. So how do I compare, even my own work in Karachi, different hospitals, a mile from each other are difficult to compare because they're using different definitions. And finally, what do we do with the data? The data, surveillance data has to get back to the policymakers and lead to change in the policy making. And often, because they are only done for the research purposes, they do not really have impact on the policy. So how do we ensure that their data utility issues are addressed? So that's very quickly on the surveillance. I'll just have one slide, a couple of slides from the ethics group. The ethics group has these members. Joe Millam is from NIH. Fogarty, he led this group. And a couple of people from emergency medicine, John Mark Hirschhorn, Jennifer Newberry, and a few people from other public health and other fields. And their objective was quite interesting, to examine the ethical and regulatory challenges in emergency care research in LMICs, and look at the key challenges and provide solutions and frameworks. And they looked at basically 6 things. So they talked about standard of care and risk-benefit assessment. And this is an interesting discussion when you have severe issues in standard of care or across LMICs. And when you have issues on care, what are the ethical challenges in research? Another thing that the group talked about is, when clinicians become researchers, and when there's a blurring of roles of clinician and researchers, that opens up a lot of ethical questions, especially in the emergency department where patients are so dependent on clinicians and the power gradient is so in favor of clinicians. Enrollment of populations with intersecting vulnerabilities. Again, the same point about the power gradient. Fair participation selection, quality of consent, and finally community engagement. So those were, again, each one of them we can spend minutes or hours to talk about, but I wanted to just give you guys very quick overview of where the CLEER group is, and hopefully leave some time for the discussion.